I sacrificed 2 agonizing years of my life wiping up after a father who never truly saw me. When the day came to read his living trust, he looked me dead in the eye and handed his entire empire to my brother. I did not cry, I did not scream. I simply smiled, signed the legal waivers, and dropped the house keys on his antique glass table. They all thought I was a pathetic, broken woman walking away with nothing. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked into the most devastating financial trap of their lives. When my father finally opened the parting gift, I left him. His victorious smirk melted into pure terror. "No, this cannot be happening," he screamed, but I was already gone. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, hit that like button and subscribe, because you will want to see exactly how I destroyed their golden child. My name is Aaliyah and I am 32 years old. The rhythmic dripping of the intravenous fluid was the only sound in the suffocating heat of the master bedroom. We lived in a stunning historic brownstone in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, a property easily worth $2.5 million. From the outside, it was a symbol of old-school Black excellence and generational wealth, but inside it was a prison. I stood beside the heavy mahogany bed, carefully adjusting the fluid line for my father Desmond. He was 68 years old and had suffered a mild stroke exactly 2 years ago. That stroke changed the trajectory of my entire life, or so my family believed. For 24 months, I had been the dutiful, invisible daughter. I packed up my beautiful, quiet apartment in Manhattan and moved back into my childhood bedroom to become his full-time caregiver. My days dissolved into an endless blur of sponge baths, physical therapy, appointments, administering medications, and cleaning up vomit. I watched my social life evaporate entirely. I sacrificed my peace, my privacy, and my sleep. I was entirely isolated, walled off from the world, while the man in the bed treated me more like a hired servant than his own flesh and blood. Every spoon of soup I fed him was met with complaints. Every attempt to make him comfortable was met with a dismissive grunt. He never said thank you. He never asked if I was exhausted. I was merely fulfilling the role he believed an unmarried daughter was meant to play. It was a thankless existence, a heavy burden I carried without a single word of complaint. The heavy oak front doors downstairs swung open with a loud, aggressive crash, shattering the quiet afternoon. Heavy footsteps echoed up the wooden staircase, accompanied by a woman's shrill, obnoxious laughter. I did not even need to look to know who had finally decided to grace us with their presence. My older brother Trayvon and his wife Kendra burst into the bedroom like they owned the place. Trayvon was 35, the undisputed golden child of the family. He strutted into the room wearing a sharply tailored suit, a heavy gold chain resting against his collar, projecting the image of a wealthy real estate mogul. Kendra was right behind him, dripping in flashy logos. She carried a pristine designer handbag that I knew for a fact was leased, and her heels clicked loudly against the hardwood floor. They had not bothered to visit this house in 8 long months. They had not called to check on my father's blood pressure, nor had they offered a single dollar or a single hour of their time to help me care for him. Yet Trayvon walked in with his chest puffed out, acting as the benevolent patriarch returning to his castle. He did not even look at me. He walked straight past where I was standing holding a soiled towel and gave our father a firm, overly dramatic handshake. Right on their heels was Mr. Sterling, the longtime family attorney, carrying a thick leather briefcase. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, thick with anticipation and an unspoken superiority that made my stomach churn. Trayvon leaned against the antique fireplace mantel, crossing his arms and flashing a confident, predatory smile. He looked completely at ease, like a king preparing for his coronation. Kendra stood beside him, wrinkling her nose as if the faint smell of antiseptic in the room offended her delicate sensibilities. I stepped back, fading into the wallpaper, observing the circus play out exactly as I had predicted. The disrespect was palpable, radiating from every movement they made. My father motioned for me to prop up his pillows. He did not look at me or say a word of gratitude as I adjusted the heavy bedding behind his back. Once he was sitting upright, he cleared his throat and nodded firmly at Mr. Sterling. The attorney opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and adjusted his glasses. The room fell completely silent. Mr. Sterling began to read the terms of my father's newly finalized living trust. He skipped the usual pleasantries and dove straight into the distribution of assets. I stood perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in front of me, listening as the lawyer pronounced the fate of the family empire. With immediate effect, 100% ownership of the Bedford-Stuyvesant brownstone was being transferred directly to Trevon. The attorney paused, turning a page before announcing that the entirety of my father's commercial construction business, the supposed crown jewel of our family wealth, was also being signed over to my brother in full. Every single share, every piece of heavy machinery, every active contract, all of it belonged to Trevon. Not a single percentage was left to a trust, to charity, or to me. The sheer magnitude of the transfer was staggering. Trevon let out a low, triumphant breath, his chest puffing out even further. Kendra practically vibrated with excitement, her eyes wide as she mentally calculated the millions they had just inherited without lifting a finger. The attorney placed the documents on a clipboard and handed my father a pen. With a steady hand completely unhindered by his previous illness, my father signed the papers. The ink soaked into the page, cementing the ultimate betrayal. I was completely erased from the family legacy with a few swift strokes of a pen. No hesitation, no remorse, just a cold business transaction that finalized my exclusion. When the last document was signed, my father handed the clipboard back to Mr. Sterling. Only then did he finally turn his gaze toward me. His eyes were cold, devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. I waited for him to speak, assuming he might offer some hollow explanation or a meager apology. Instead, he delivered a speech dripping with patriarchal toxicity that cut straight to the bone. He looked me up and down and stated plainly that Trevon was the man of the house now. According to my father, Trevon was the only one capable of carrying on our Black generational wealth. He said that a business empire and a historic estate belonged in the hands of a son who could lead the family name into the future. Then his voice grew even sharper. He told me that since I was unmarried in my 30s, I was a liability. He actually had the nerve to look me in the eye and say that I had been living rent-free under his roof for 2 years, eating his food and taking up space. Because I had no husband and no traditional family of my own, he deemed me unworthy of holding any real assets. He framed my 2 years of grueling, unpaid, isolating caregiving as a favor he had done for me, a charity he had extended to his pathetic single daughter. He told me I was getting absolutely nothing from the trust, because I had already taken enough from him. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air. Trevon smirked, a cruel, satisfied look on his face, while Kendra actually let out a quiet scoff of agreement. They stood there basking in their stolen glory, entirely convinced that they had just won the ultimate prize. They thought I was crushed. They thought I was a powerless maid who had just been thrown to the curb. But they were about to learn a very hard lesson about underestimating the quiet ones. The trap had been set long before they ever walked through those oak doors, and they were entirely oblivious to the destruction waiting for them. My silence was not a surrender. It was the ultimate preparation for a total reckoning they would never, ever forget. I had planned this moment down to the final detail. Kendra stepped forward, the sharp click of her red bottom heels echoing against the hardwood floor. She positioned herself right next to my father, crossing her arms and tilting her head with a look of manufactured pity that made my skin crawl. Her diamond rings caught the afternoon light as she dramatically sighed, looking at me as if I were a stain on the antique rug. She slowly licked her lips, clearly savoring the opportunity to kick me while she thought I was completely down. "Well, Aaliyah," Kendra began, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness, "I suppose this is the part where you start packing up your little bags. You have been squatting here long enough, do you not think? It is time for you to go out into the real world and find a real job instead of just wiping up vomit and pretending you are some kind of martyr." She looked at Trevon, sharing a cruel smirk with my brother, before turning her venom back on me. "You see, Trevon and I have an image to uphold. We cannot have a grown woman lounging around the estate contributing absolutely nothing to the family portfolio. We belong to a much higher tax bracket now. The aesthetic of this household is going to change drastically. We are going to hire a team of elite certified private nurses to manage Desmond around the clock. Professionals who actually have credentials, not just a desperate spinster daughter hiding from reality. My father nodded along to her speech, validating every vicious word she threw my way. He did not defend the 2 years I spent managing his medication schedules, carrying him to the bathroom, or sitting awake through the night when his blood pressure spiked. He just sat there accepting Kendra's narrative that I was nothing more than a pathetic freeloader who had finally overstayed her welcome. Kendra took a step closer, lowering her voice into a condescending whisper. "Do not look so sad, Aaliyah. This is actually a favor to you. You can finally stop wearing those cheap sweatpants and get your life together. If you need a reference for a basic clerical job, Trevon might be able to make a call to one of his lower-level associates. We do want to see you survive, even if it is at the bottom of the ladder." Her monologue was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was attempting to strip away every ounce of my dignity, expecting me to crumble into a puddle of tears, to beg my father for a tiny allowance, or to scream in irrational anger. She wanted a reaction. She needed to feel the power of crushing me beneath her designer heels. They fed off my perceived misery, drawing strength from the illusion that they held my entire future in their hands. They were absolutely certain they had just won the war. I let her finish her little speech without a single interruption. I just stood there and watched them. Instead of breaking down begging or screaming, which is exactly what my entire family expected me to do, I felt a profound, icy liberation wash over my entire body. The heavy chains of daughterly obligation I had dragged around for 24 months simply snapped and dissolved into dust. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel rejected. I felt the dangerous thrill of a hunter watching her prey walk willingly into a steel cage. They looked at my plain clothes and tired eyes, seeing only a helpless, broken caregiver. They had no idea who was actually standing in front of them. Beneath the messy bun and the faded college shirt was a highly calculating mind that spent a decade dismantling complex financial fraud for a living. I was a senior forensic accountant, a predator in the corporate world, trained to trace every hidden dollar and exploit every single fiscal vulnerability. For 2 years, I played the submissive servant while secretly mapping their financial ruin. My father and my brother thought they were playing chess against a novice, but they did not even realize the board belonged to me. The sheer arrogance radiating from Kendra and Trayvon was almost comical. Their insults bounced off me like tiny pebbles against solid titanium. I took one very slow, deep, steadying breath, absorbing the absolute quietness of my own mind. Every vicious taunt Kendra threw my way only confirmed that they deserved exactly what was coming to them. The emotional manipulation that used to trigger my anxiety now felt like a desperate, pathetic joke. I was fully detached, operating on pure, unadulterated logic. My silence was not shock. It was the calm before the execution. I stood my ground perfectly, absolutely refusing to flinch or surrender at all. "Mr. Sterling." The family attorney cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to break the heavy tension filling the room. He pulled a final document from his leather briefcase and slid it across the glass coffee table toward me. This was the non-contest waiver. It was a legally binding agreement stating that I accepted the terms of the living trust, acknowledging my complete disinheritance, and forfeiting any future right to sue my brother or my father for a share of the estate. "Aaliyah," Mr. Sterling said, his voice laced with a thin veneer of professional pity. "I need you to sign this document to finalize the transfer of the property and the business to Trayvon." Trayvon chuckled a low sound of pure victory. "Go ahead, little sister," he mocked, leaning forward to tap the paper with his index finger. "Sign it. Make it official so we can all move on with our lives. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." I did not hesitate for even a single fraction of a second. I reached into the pocket of my oversized cardigan and pulled out a sleek, heavy Mont Blanc pen. The polished silver caught the light, completely contrasting with my seemingly ragged appearance. Trayvon eyed the expensive pen for a moment, a brief flash of confusion crossing his face, but he quickly dismissed it, returning to his arrogant smirk. Without shedding a single tear, without a tremor in my hand, I leaned over the glass table. I pressed the nib of the pen against the thick paper and signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. I made sure my signature was bold, flawless, and undeniably absolute. I was not signing away my future. I was sealing their doom. By putting my name down permanently on that waiver, I was legally locking Trayvon into the exact position I needed him to be in. I capped my pen, the sharp click echoing in the quiet room, and slid the clipboard across the table to Mr. Sterling. Trayvon let out a loud laugh, clapping his hands together. He actually thought that I was completely capitulating and giving up. He genuinely believed I was walking away empty-handed, completely destroyed by his superior standing in the family. He thought he had just inherited an empire, unaware that he had just signed his own financial death warrant. I offered him a chilling smile. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy set of brass house keys. I held them up for a brief second, letting them jingle in the quiet room before dropping them onto the center of the glass coffee table. They hit the surface with a loud final clatter. I turned my back on my father, my brother, and his wife, and walked out of the bedroom without a single backward glance. I slowly walked straight down the long hallway to the hall closet, opening the door to reveal a sleek, hard-shell suitcase. I had packed it 3 days ago. My departure was not a frantic retreat. It was a highly orchestrated maneuver. I pulled the handle up, the wheels gliding smoothly over the hardwood floor as I walked back toward the front entrance. I paused right at the threshold of the living room where my father could see me from his chair. Reaching into the side pocket of my bag, I pulled out a thick slate gray envelope. It was heavy, sealed with wax, and contained the ultimate destruction of the patriarch who had just cast me aside. I stepped into the room, maintaining my icy composure, and gently dropped the envelope directly onto my father's lap. He looked down at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. "A parting gift, Dad." I said, my voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of the daughterly warmth he had exploited for 2 years. "Read it when I am gone." Before anyone in the room could utter a single word, I turned on my heel, gripped the handle of my suitcase, and walked out the front door. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing their fate. The sound was crisp and final, marking the absolute end of my servitude. The heavy oak door clicked shut downstairs, and the vibration echoed through the floorboards of the master bedroom. For exactly 15 minutes, a bizarre silence hung in the air. The grand illusion of the loving, victorious family remained intact, just long enough for the sound of my Uber pulling away from the curb to fade into the Brooklyn street noise. Then, the supportive son act vanished completely. Trevin let out a sharp, genuine laugh that held zero warmth. It was the sound of a predator who had finally cornered its prey and realized the hunt was over. He unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, letting it hang loose, shedding the patriarch persona he had worn just moments before. He walked over to the side of the bed, looked down at the array of medical equipment I had meticulously maintained, and scowled. With a sudden violent kick, Trayvon sent the metal tray holding my father's blood pressure monitor and daily medication organizers crashing to the floor. Plastic pill bottles shattered loudly, scattering tiny white capsules and heavy metal instruments across the expensive Persian rug. My father jumped, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He grabbed the armrests of his recliner, his voice trembling as he asked his son what on earth he was doing. Trayvon did not even bother to look at him. He pulled a sleek, expensive smartphone from his inner pocket and began scrolling rapidly. He paced the length of the room, his expensive shoes crunching over the spilled medication, completely ignoring the mess he had just created. He brought the phone to his ear and waited. When the line connected, his voice shifted into a loud, booming cadence of an arrogant businessman. He asked for Marcus, a high-profile real estate broker known for flipping properties in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Trayvon did not use a hushed tone. He did not step out into the hallway. He stood right at the foot of my father's bed and loudly announced that the historic property was officially his. He demanded that Marcus get a team over to the house by tomorrow morning to take listing photographs. He emphasized that he wanted a cash buyer and a fast close, proudly declaring that the estate was easily worth $2.5 million in the current market. My father's mouth dropped open. The healthy color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He clutched the arm of his chair, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. He tried to speak, tried to assert the authority he had wielded so effortlessly against me just an hour prior, but his voice was shockingly weak. He asked Traven what he meant by listing the house. He reminded his son that this was the family home, the ancestral headquarters that was meant to be preserved for future generations of our bloodline. Trayvon ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned to face our father, his expression completely devoid of the respect and admiration he had faked during the reading of the trust. He looked at the old man, not as a father, but as an obstacle that had finally been neutralized. Desmond's chest heaved as he demanded answers. He commanded Trayvon to explain himself, relying on the old booming patriarch voice that had controlled our family for decades. But the power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted. Trayvon now held the deed, the business, and the ultimate legal authority. He sneered, looking down at the man who had just handed him a massive empire. Trayvon reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was not a legal document or a loving letter. It was a crumpled, brightly colored brochure. With a quick flick of his wrist, Trayvon casually tossed the folded pamphlet directly at my father's chest. It bounced off his pajamas and landed face up on his lap, right next to the slate gray envelope I had left behind. My father picked up the brochure with shaking fingers. He squinted at the cheap, glossy paper. It was an advertisement for a state-funded low-income nursing home located deep in the dreary outskirts of the city. The facility was notorious for its abysmal conditions, a place where forgotten people were sent to fade away in crowded, understaffed wards. The realization hit my father like a physical blow. He looked up at Trayvon, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He stammered, asking if this was some kind of sick joke. He reminded Trayvon that he was supposed to be cared for here in his own home, with private nurses paid for by the family business. He reminded Trayvon of the promise to maintain the estate and uphold their legacy. Kendra, who had been leaning against the antique dresser examining her nails, suddenly let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stepped away from the furniture and strutted over to Trayvon, wrapping her arm around his waist. She looked at my father with an expression of profound disgust. She complained loudly about the oppressive atmosphere of the room, dramatically waving her hand in front of her nose. She stated that the entire house had a distinct, inescapable sick smell that made her physically nauseous. She declared that there was absolutely no way she was going to live in a building that smelled like old medicine and impending death. Kendra told my father that he was completely delusional if he thought she was going to spend her prime years managing a rotation of private nurses or putting up with hospital beds in her living room. She laughed again, a harsh grating sound, and told my father to pack whatever fit into 2 small suitcases because the state facility had strict limits on personal belongings. Trayvon nodded in agreement with his wife, completely unfazed by the absolute horror radiating from his father. He stated plainly that the brownstone was too valuable to waste as a makeshift hospice ward. He needed the capital locked inside the brick and mortar, and he needed it immediately. He told my father to consider the cheap nursing home a generous offer, considering he could have just left him sitting on the street corner. The absolute cruelty in Trayvon's voice was paralyzing. There was no love, no loyalty, and certainly no respect for the man who had favored him his entire life. My father gripped the edges of his recliner, his knuckles turning white. He demanded to know why Trayvon was doing this. He yelled about the commercial construction business, shouting that the company generated more than enough annual revenue to support his medical care and maintain the historic property. He begged his golden child to explain why he was destroying the family legacy for a quick cash sale. Trayvon's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a dark, frantic intensity. He stepped right up to the recliner, leaning down so his face was inches from my father's trembling head. Trayvon brutally confessed the reality he had been hiding behind his tailored suits and leased sports cars. He admitted that his massive investments in cryptocurrency had crashed spectacularly months ago. He had been playing high-stakes games with money he did not actually have, trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. Now the bill had come due. Trayvon angrily revealed that he was drowning in margin calls from ruthless creditors. He needed the $2.5 million in cash from the sale of the brownstone immediately, just to keep himself out of prison and prevent his creditors from coming after him. He screamed that the construction business my father was so proud of was practically useless to him because he could not liquidate its heavy machinery fast enough to cover his massive debts. He needed liquid cash, and he needed it by the end of the month. As Trayvon yelled, spitting out the truth of his profound financial incompetence, Desmond felt a sudden suffocating panic grip his chest. The room began to spin. The air grew thin and heavy. Desmond looked at the golden child he had worshipped, the son he had entrusted with the preservation of his life's work, and finally saw him for what he truly was. Trayvon was not a savvy businessman or a strong patriarch. He was a reckless, desperate parasite who had completely destroyed his own life and was now cannibalizing his father's remaining assets to survive. The gravity of the situation crushed Desmond under its immense weight. He had bypassed probate, signed over every deed, and transferred every shred of authority directly to this desperate man. He had stripped himself of all legal power and handed the keys to his kingdom to a fraud. A deep, agonizing realization pierced through Desmond's shock. He remembered the quiet, relentless dedication I had shown him every single day for 2 years. He thought about how I had fed him, bathed him, and managed his chaotic medical schedule without a single word of complaint. He had looked me in the eye just an hour ago and discarded me, insulting my dedication and driving me out of the house. He realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that he had just banished the only person on earth who actually cared for his well-being. He was entirely alone, trapped in a house that was no longer his, at the mercy of a son who viewed him as nothing more than garbage to be thrown away. His eyes slowly drifted down to his own lap, where the heavy slate-gray envelope Aaliyah had left behind rested against his blanket. The thick paper felt mockingly substantial. His hands, weakened by the stroke and trembling with a newly discovered terror, fumbled awkwardly with the wax seal closing the flap. Across the room, Trayvon had already turned his back, pacing near the large bay windows, shouting into his smartphone about appraisal values and premium staging companies. Kendra was ignoring the entire situation, too busy taking selfies in the antique gilded mirror above the fireplace, completely unbothered by the destruction of the family she had just married into. Neither of them paid the slightest bit of attention to the old man, suffocating in the recliner. Desmond prayed with every remaining ounce of his strength that Aaliyah had left a letter of apology. He desperately hoped the envelope contained a tearful plea to return to the house, a promise that she would overlook his extreme cruelty and immediately resume her post by his bedside. He needed her forgiveness now more than he had ever needed anything in his entire life. He slid his thumbnail under the thick flap, tearing the heavy cardstock open with jagged, uneven rips. He fully expected to find a handwritten note on her personal floral stationery. He expected to read words of sorrow, familial duty, and emotional submission. He pulled the contents free, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking an exit. But the texture of the paper was entirely wrong. It was not a single heartfelt letter written by a grieving daughter. It was a massive, professionally bound stack of legal-sized documents. The sheer weight of the packet was substantial, pulling his shaking hands down toward his knees. Desmond stared at the cover page, his mind struggling to process the harsh block lettering printed across the top. The bold black text read, "Comprehensive Forensic Audit and Asset Liquidation Report." At the top right corner of the page sat the intimidating sharp logo of Vanguard Financial Forensics, widely known as one of the most ruthless, elite accounting and corporate investigation firms on Wall Street. Desmond blinked rapidly, trying to clear the sudden dizzying confusion from his mind. He flipped to the executive summary, his eyes straining to read the small print. The dense financial jargon initially blurred together into a sea of meaningless numbers, but the highlighted red text immediately commanded his full attention. The words "insolvency and federal tax lien" jumped off the bright white page, striking him with the force of a physical blow. He turned the pages frantically, his eyes darting across detailed spreadsheets, international bank transfer records, and highlighted withdrawal logs. The horrifying truth was laid bare in meticulously organized, absolutely undeniable columns of data. The family commercial construction business. The mighty empire he had spent 40 arduous years building with his own sweat and blood did not exist anymore. It had been completely bankrupt for exactly 2 years. The forensic audit traced every single missing dollar with terrifying precision. It displayed a devastating chronological timeline of corporate theft that made Desmond feel physically ill. Trayvon had not been managing the company during Desmond's recovery. He had been bleeding it completely dry. The reports detailed hundreds of unauthorized wire transfers, moving rapidly from the primary business accounts to unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. Trayvon had aggressively embezzled millions of dollars, maliciously siphoning the company's vital operating capital to fund his lavish personal lifestyle and his highly disastrous digital investments. Desmond read in pure horror as the documents exposed exactly how Trayvon falsified monthly revenue reports and took out massive high-interest corporate loans using the company's heavy machinery as collateral. When the volatile crypto market crashed and completely wiped out his portfolio, the aggressive lenders swooped in and seized all the construction equipment. The business was now nothing but a hollow, empty shell with a revoked operating license and millions of dollars in outstanding vendor lawsuits. But the nightmare detailed in the heavy binder did not stop with the ruined construction business. Desmond turned to the section regarding the Bedford-Stuyvesant brownstone, his hands sweating profusely. A bright red tab marked a terrifying federal document that made his stomach drop into a bottomless void. It was an official notice of intent to seize property directly from the Internal Revenue Service. Because Trayvon had completely stopped paying employee payroll taxes and federal corporate taxes long before the business officially collapsed, the federal government had aggressively stepped in to collect their dues. The IRS had successfully pierced the corporate veil, taking the massive corporate tax debt and tying it directly to the family's primary physical asset. There was a staggering $1.8 million federal tax lien attached directly to the historic Brooklyn brownstone. The $2.5 million house that Trayvon had just boasted about selling to cover his personal debts was practically worthless to him now. It was fully encumbered by toxic, inescapable federal debt. Desmond could not breathe. The air in the master bedroom suddenly felt thick, hot, and suffocating. The generational wealth he thought he was passing down, the proud legacy he had so eagerly handed to his golden child, was a complete and total illusion. He realized with crushing clarity that Trayvon had been lying to his face every single day for the past 2 years, orchestrating a massive criminal cover-up, while Desmond was trapped in this very bed, recovering from a stroke. The betrayal was absolute, documented permanently in stark black and white ink. Desmond looked up at Trayvon, who was still bragging loudly on his cell phone across the room, completely unaware of the financial nuclear bomb currently resting on his father's lap. Tucked at the very back of the massive audit report was a single piece of crisp, premium white paper. It was a typed letter from Aaliyah, bearing her official corporate signature block. Desmond read it, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. Aaliyah's tone was clinical, detached, and utterly merciless. She explained that she did not spend the last 24 months simply wiping his mouth, washing his clothes, and fluffing his pillows. While Desmond slept and while Trayvon completely ignored them both, Aaliyah had been working full-time from her encrypted laptop in the dark corner of his bedroom. She was never a helpless spinster seeking his approval. She was a senior forensic accountant at Vanguard Financial, the exact firm that had authored the devastating audit on his lap. She had uncovered Trayvon's massive embezzlement scheme within weeks of moving back home to care for him. The letter detailed exactly how Aaliyah quietly watched her father continue to worship a son who was actively destroying the family name and robbing them blind. Instead of warning them and facing their inevitable gaslighting, she used her elite financial clearance to take aggressive, silent action. Over the past 2 years, Aaliyah had systematically navigated the shadowy secondary debt markets, She utilized her own substantial corporate bonuses and her highly specialized industry access to quietly purchase the toxic loans Traven had taken out against the company. She had successfully negotiated with the IRS and the angry commercial creditors, brilliantly consolidating the entire $1.8 million debt under a private holding company that she fully owned and operated. She was now the sole legal creditor of the entire estate, holding all the cards. The final paragraph of the letter delivered the ultimate devastating checkmate that made Desmond's heart practically stop beating. Aaliyah explained the harsh legal reality of the living trust Desmond had just forced the lawyer to execute. By demanding that the assets be transferred immediately to Trayvon, deliberately skipping the protective legal process of a standard probate court, Desmond had triggered a fatal liability clause. Trayvon did not just inherit the valuable deed to the brownstone. By eagerly signing that non-contest waiver and enthusiastically accepting the immediate transfer of the estate, Trayvon legally and personally assumed full responsibility for all encumbrances currently attached to the property. He had just voluntarily chained himself to a $1.8 million federal tax lien. If he failed to pay Aaliyah's holding company immediately, the government would not just seize the historic house. They would legally seize Trayvon's personal bank accounts, permanently garnish any future wages he might earn, and potentially prosecute him for the original corporate tax fraud that created the mess. Desmond stared at the paper, the reality of Aaliyah's brilliant, ruthless trap freezing the blood in his veins. Trayvon had walked into the bedroom expecting to claim a massive fortune, but he had just legally signed his entire life away to the sister he deeply despised. The heavy silence in the room finally broke through Trayvon's arrogant phone call. He lowered his smartphone, the high-profile real estate broker still chattering aimlessly through the tiny speaker, and turned to look at our father. Desmond was completely paralyzed, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide and locked onto the thick, professionally bound forensic audit resting on his lap. Trayvon frowned, profoundly irritated by the old man's sudden dramatic catatonia. He marched over to the recliner, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly over the scattered pills he had kicked to the floor just moments ago. He demanded to know what Desmond was staring at, deeply insulted that his victory speech was being ignored. Without waiting for a response, Trayvon violently snatched the heavy document right out of our father's trembling hands. He expected to find a pathetic tear-stained letter from a broken sister begging for a monthly allowance or a place to sleep. Instead, he found himself staring directly at the razor-sharp logo of Vanguard Financial Forensics. Trayvon possessed just enough corporate awareness to recognize that prestigious, terrifying name immediately. The blood began to drain from his face before he even read the first full sentence. His eyes darted across the executive summary, tracing the aggressive red text highlighting the words, Federal Tax Lien and Corporate Insolvency. He flipped the thick pages frantically, the crisp paper slicing against his panicked fingers. He saw the exact dates of his unauthorized wire transfers to the cryptocurrency exchanges. He saw the vendor lawsuits, the empty ledgers, and the forensic proof of his massive embezzlement. And then he saw the inescapable reality of the $1.8 million debt attached firmly to the brownstone. The color completely vanished from Trayvon's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the glass coffee table to keep from collapsing entirely. The overwhelming weight of his own profound stupidity crashed down upon him. He had been so incredibly eager to seize control of the estate that he did not even bother to hire his own legal counsel to review the trust documents. He had gleefully bypassed the protective barrier of probate court, completely avoiding the standard legal shield that would have isolated the massive debt to the estate itself. By eagerly signing the non-contest waiver and enthusiastically accepting the immediate transfer of the living trust, Trayvon had legally assumed full personal liability for every single cent of that toxic federal debt. He was entirely on the hook. The IRS would not just take the historic house to settle the score. They would seize his personal bank accounts, liquidate his leased luxury cars, and permanently garnish any future wages he might earn. He remembered my faded college shirts, my messy buns, and my quiet submission. It had all been camouflage. While he was out leasing sports cars and playing a successful tycoon, I was systematically mapping his financial execution. He had walked into this bedroom believing he was a king, claiming his rightful throne, but he had actually sprinted headfirst into a flawlessly executed, legally binding steel trap. The $2.5 million asset he planned to sell for quick cash was effectively worthless. Buried under a mountain of debt, he was now personally required to pay to the very sister he had spent his entire life mocking and belittling. Kendra finally lowered her smartphone, severely annoyed by the sudden suffocating tension ruining her perfect selfie lighting. She turned away from the antique gilded mirror, her perfectly manicured brow furrowing as she took in the horrific scene unfolding behind her. Traven was swaying on his feet, hyperventilating, his eyes bugging out of his head as he stared at a thick stack of paper. Desmond looked like he was about to suffer a second fatal stroke right there in the recliner, his chest heaving with silent, terrified gasps. Kendra strutted over the sharp click of her red bottom heels, sounding entirely out of place in the newly destroyed atmosphere. She asked Trayvon what was wrong, her voice laced with sharp irritation rather than actual concern. When her husband could not form a single coherent sentence, she aggressively ripped the forensic audit out of his shaking hands. Kendra did not possess a background in high-level finance, but she did not need a specialized degree to understand the bold, terrifying numbers printed on the official IRS notices. She clearly saw the words, personal liability, and the massive $1.8 million figure circling her husband's name. She realized that the non-contest waiver Trayvon had so proudly signed was actually a financial bear trap. The pristine, luxurious future she had been mentally decorating just 5 minutes ago instantly vaporized into thin air. There would be no elite team of credentialed private nurses. There would be no massive cash payout from a quick real estate flip. There would be no designer shopping sprees, no lavish European vacations, and no elite country club memberships funded by a stolen inheritance. She was legally bound to a man who is now millions of dollars in debt to the ruthless federal government. Kendra dropped the heavy binder onto the glass table and unleashed a feral, deafening scream that physically shook the antique chandelier hanging above them. She turned on Trayvon with the vicious intensity of a cornered, starving animal. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know how he could be so exceptionally, unbelievably stupid. She screamed about her curated social media image, her carefully cultivated aesthetic of extreme wealth, and the absolute humiliation of being married to a broke, fraudulent federal debtor. She hit his chest repeatedly with her expensive designer handbag, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized her lavish lifestyle was completely, irreversibly dead. She screamed that they would be living on the streets, that her designer wardrobe would be seized, and that her prestigious friends would laugh her out of the city. The luxurious facade she had flaunted to her elite social circle was a total lie, and the impending financial ruin would be violently public. She cursed his name, cursed his arrogance, and cursed the day she ever married into this pathetic, broken family. Desmond could do nothing but sit paralyzed in his chair, forced to watch his beloved golden child and his vicious daughter-in-law tear each other apart in the smoldering ruins of his former empire. Trayvon finally snapped out of his paralyzing shock, propelled into a frantic, mindless panic by his wife's deafening screams and physical blows. He pulled his sleek smartphone back out of his suit pocket, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the hardwood floor. He frantically swiped through his contacts, his breathing ragged, shallow, and highly erratic. He bypassed the real estate brokers and the luxury car dealers, desperately searching for the one person who controlled his entire fate. He found my name and hit the call button, bringing the phone to his ear with desperate, sweaty urgency. He needed to order me to stop this immediately. He needed to scream at me, to use his old authority, to demand that I tear up the documents and release him from the financial death sentence he had willingly signed. He dialed the number over and over again, pacing the length of the destroyed master bedroom, ignoring the crunch of scattered pills, silently begging the universe for a chance to undo his monumental arrogance. Miles away from the suffocating chaos and screaming matches of the brownstone, the atmosphere was entirely different. I sat comfortably in the spacious back seat of a luxury black SUV, gliding smoothly through the vibrant neon-lit streets of downtown Brooklyn. The city lights washed over the plush leather interior, reflecting off the tinted windows in a hypnotic, calming rhythm. I watched the city blur past, thinking about the 2 years of verbal abuse, the condescending remarks, and the absolute lack of gratitude. They had handed me the shovel, and I had simply allowed them to dig their own graves. The heavy, oppressive weight of familial duty that had crushed my shoulders for 2 long years was completely gone. The air conditioning was perfectly cool, the scent of the leather was rich, and the absolute silence in the car was an incredible luxury. On the passenger seat right next to me, my smartphone suddenly illuminated the dark leather. The screen flashed brightly, displaying the name Trayvon Adams, alongside an incoming call notification. The device vibrated urgently, a persistent, pathetic buzzing of a man realizing he was trapped in a cage of his own making. I leaned over and looked at the glowing screen. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering sisterly obligation or sudden guilt. I felt the profound, icy satisfaction of a master architect watching the final fatal domino fall perfectly into place. I let the phone ring for a few seconds, savoring the visual proof of his complete and utter destruction. With a slow, deliberate motion, I picked up the device. I offered the glowing screen a chilling, cold smile. I did not answer his frantic call. I did not send a mocking text message. I simply pressed my thumb against the red icon, swiped downward, and hit the block button. The screen instantly went black, cutting off his desperate lifeline forever. I turned my attention back to the beautiful city lights passing by the window, entirely ready to begin my new, untethered life. The sleek glass doors of Vanguard Financial Forensics slid open on the 40th floor, revealing the sprawling sunlit expanse of the Manhattan headquarters. I stepped out of the private executive elevator, leaving the heavy, suffocating memories of the Brooklyn brownstone far behind me. The worn-out sweatpants, faded cardigans, and exhausted posture were completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp charcoal pinstripe suit tailored to absolute perfection. My hair, once pulled into a frantic, messy bun to keep out of the way of medical equipment, was now styled in a sleek, immaculate silk press that cascaded past my shoulders. The sharp, authoritative click of my patent leather stilettos against the polished Italian marble floor announced my arrival, drawing respectful nods from junior analysts and senior partners alike. I was no longer the exhausted, invisible caregiver who blended into the wallpaper. I was a senior forensic accountant, a highly trained financial predator returning to her natural hunting ground. The air up here was crisp and heavily filtered, smelling of expensive espresso and high-stakes corporate warfare. I walked past the panoramic windows, showcasing the jagged skyline of the financial district, feeling the electric pulse of the city hum beneath my feet. Every single step I took was a reclamation of my true identity. For 2 grueling years, I had suppressed my intellect, shrinking myself into a meek, subservient daughter to map out the exact financial vulnerabilities of the men who thought they owned my future. Now operating in the cold, ruthless light of the corporate world, my true capabilities were fully unleashed. I swiped my platinum security badge, the heavy glass doors to the elite investigations wing, parting silently for me. My corner office waited at the end of the long corridor, an immaculate fortress of glass and steel. It was a space designed for dismantling complex financial fraud, equipped with multiple high-definition monitors displaying encrypted global banking networks and offshore asset trackers. Sitting down at my massive executive desk, I felt a deep, resonant surge of power. The dual monitors flared to life, illuminating my face with the glow of complex data streams. This was my empire. Here I did not change bedpans or endure the arrogant taunts of a delusional brother. Here I dissected the financial lives of corrupt CEOs and brought multi-million-dollar syndicates to their knees. The transition was completely seamless. The icy detachment that had carried me through the weekend now crystallized into pure, focused ambition. I adjusted the cuffs of my silk blouse, logged into the highly secure federal database, and prepared to observe the absolute destruction I had set into motion. The journey to this moment had required an inhuman level of patience. Every time Kendra had mocked my plain clothing, every time Traven had flaunted his leased luxury vehicles, and every time my father had treated me like a disposable servant, I had to bite my tongue and smile. I had channeled every ounce of my rage into building an airtight legal fortress. The corporate environment around me was a testament to that silent perseverance. The hum of the servers, the quiet conversations of the analysts outside my glass walls, and the sheer magnitude of the financial power concentrated on this floor were all tools at my disposal. I was no longer playing a rigged game in a dilapidated Brooklyn brownstone. I was playing on a global board, and I held every single advantage. The heavy glass door of my office swung open, and Malik strode in carrying a thick stack of freshly printed dossiers. Malik was a brilliant former federal prosecutor turned forensic investigator, and he was my closest ally within Vanguard Financial. He dropped the heavy folders onto the center of my desk with a deeply satisfying thud, a sharp, knowing grin spreading across his handsome face. He leaned against the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing his arms and shaking his head in absolute disbelief at the sheer magnitude of the trap we had just successfully triggered. He tapped the top folder with his index finger, his voice laced with dark amusement. He announced that the Internal Revenue Service had officially processed the expedited estate transfer documents first thing this morning. The bureaucratic machine had moved with unusual, terrifying speed. The non-contest waiver and the living trust execution forms had been filed, stamped, and permanently recorded in the federal database. Malik pulled out the official confirmation receipt and slid it across the smooth surface toward me. He pointed to the highlighted section confirming that Traven Adams had legally assumed full, unmitigated personal liability for the entire $1.8 million federal tax lien. There were no loopholes, no legal technicalities, and absolutely no avenues of escape. By rushing to bypass probate court, in his greedy desperation to claim the brownstone, Trevon had willingly chained himself to a financial anchor that was currently dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. Malik and I reviewed the encrypted tracking software on my secondary monitor. We watched the automated federal algorithms kick into high gear. The IRS collection protocols were already actively flagging Trevon's personal banking profiles. His checking accounts, his meager savings, and his highly leveraged stock portfolios were all currently locked in the crosshairs of the federal government. Malik chuckled, amazed by the flawless execution of the maneuver. He noted that Traven was likely waking up to frozen assets and declined credit cards across the city. The mathematical precision of the checkmate was stunning. I had spent 2 years quietly buying up the toxic debt of my father's ruined construction company, meticulously routing it through impenetrable shell companies and private holding firms. I had consolidated the chaos into a single, lethal weapon. Malik congratulated me on the sheer brilliance of the operation, admitting he had rarely seen a financial predator walk so willingly and enthusiastically into their own slaughter. We had weaponized his own insatiable greed and blinding arrogance completely against him. I stared at the confirmation receipt, absorbing the absolute certainty of my victory. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had permanently crushed every single delusion of grandeur Trevon and my father had ever harbored. The forensic audit was complete, the legal filings were locked tight, and my brother was now the official property of the Internal Revenue Service. Malik walked around the desk and pointed to a secondary graph on the screen, detailing the cascading effect of the debt assumption. Because Trevon had used several of his personal accounts to artificially inflate the construction company's bottom line during his earlier embezzlement schemes, the federal auditors had already established a direct link between his personal wealth and the toxic corporate liabilities. It was a beautiful, catastrophic domino effect. Once the lien attached to his name via the living trust, it instantly triggered default clauses on his luxury car leases and his high-end credit cards. His entire financial existence was unraveling in real time. We had not just leveled the playing field, we had completely obliterated his false empire, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of the debt he had secretly accrued. The quiet, triumphant atmosphere of my corner office was violently interrupted by the sharp, urgent buzzing of my private security intercom. I reached over and pressed the flashing silver button. The tense voice of Marcus, the head of building security for the 40th floor, filled the room. He apologized for the interruption but stated there was a severe situation unfolding in the main lobby on the ground floor. My eyes locked with Malik as Marcus quickly explained the disturbance. 3 highly agitated individuals had just stormed past the front reception desk, bypassing the strict visitor check-in protocols and aggressively demanding immediate access to the executive suites. Marcus stated they were causing a massive public spectacle, shouting my name, and threatening to completely ruin my professional reputation if I did not come down to face them immediately. I tapped a few keys on my keyboard, bringing up the live feed from the high-definition security cameras positioned in the grand marble lobby downstairs. The screen illuminated with a scene of absolute, chaotic desperation. Trayvon was pacing wildly in front of the security turnstiles, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and entirely unkempt, a stark contrast to his usual polished arrogance. He was screaming at a stone-faced security guard, wildly waving a crumpled stack of legal papers in his hands. Right behind him stood Kendra. She was practically vibrating with rage, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her messy hair, shouting frantic demands at the bewildered receptionists. But the true source of the chaotic volume was my Aunt Yvonne. She was a loud, overbearing woman who had spent her entire life enabling my father's toxic behavior and worshipping Trayvon as the flawless savior of the family. Aunt Yvonne was physically blocking the main entrance, waving her arms and yelling at the top of her lungs. I watched the silent video feed as she dramatically pointed up toward the ceiling, undoubtedly screaming about my lack of familial loyalty and threatening to expose me to my corporate superiors. They had finally realized the absolute finality of their financial doom and decided their only remaining tactic was public humiliation. They genuinely believed that by storming my highly prestigious workplace and throwing a massive embarrassing tantrum in front of Wall Street executives, they could bully me into submission. They thought they could shame me into tearing up the legally binding contracts and absorbing the massive debt they had brought upon themselves. Malik leaned over my shoulder, staring at the security feed with a look of profound disgust. He asked if I wanted him to call the police and have them forcefully removed for trespassing. I watched Trayvon's panicked, sweaty face on the monitor, observing the frantic gestures of a man who knew his entire life was completely over. The urge to let security drag them out onto the street was incredibly strong, but a cold, calculating thought crossed my mind. They wanted a confrontation in my territory. I reached for the intercom button, my voice dropping into an icy, commanding register, fully preparing to deal with the pathetic disturbance they had brought to my front door. I pressed the button and spoke clearly into the microphone. I instructed Marcus not to call the police just yet. I told him to authorize their security badges and escort them directly up to the main conference room on the 40th floor. I wanted them to see exactly where I worked. I wanted them to step out of the elevator and feel the crushing, intimidating weight of the corporate power they had blindly challenged. They had spent years treating me like a pathetic, helpless maid, convinced that I was entirely dependent on their mercy. It was time for them to walk into my fortress and realize they were nothing more than insignificant insects in a world they could not even begin to comprehend. I released the intercom button, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket, and stood up from my desk. The final confrontation was here, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their total destruction. I stepped out of my office, signaling Malik to follow close behind. I had initially planned to let building security escort my family up to the private conference room, but a second glance at the live security feed on Malik's tablet revealed they were aggressively refusing to comply. Aunt Yvonne was physically planting her feet into the polished Italian marble floor, waving off the guards with dramatic sweeping gestures. She did not want a private meeting behind closed doors. She wanted an audience. She wanted a public stage. If my family desperately wanted to play this out in the expansive, highly populated main lobby of a Wall Street financial fortress, I was more than happy to oblige. I tapped the call button for the private executive elevator, the brushed steel doors opening instantly. As the high-speed car plummeted 39 floors toward the ground level, the absolute chaos unfolding below was reaching a fevered, hysterical pitch. Aunt Yvonne was weaponizing her age, her race, and her loud theatrical voice to completely paralyze the building security. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was banking on the fact that the corporate guards would hesitate to physically remove an older black woman actively screaming about systemic oppression and familial betrayal. Vanguard Financial handled billions of dollars in global assets, and the last thing the firm wanted was a viral discrimination incident. Her voice echoed off the high vaulted ceilings, cutting through the low murmur of morning business deals and the quiet shuffling of highly paid analysts. She was shouting at the top of her lungs, pointing an accusing finger at the massive corporate logo mounted on the wall behind the reception desk. She shrieked that the firm was harboring a criminal, screaming that I was actively stealing generational black wealth from my own flesh and blood. She yelled that I had maliciously manipulated a sick elderly stroke victim into signing away his legacy, painting herself and Trayvon as the helpless, victimized targets of a greedy, sociopathic corporate monster. Trayvon stood right beside her, sweating profusely through his designer shirt, nodding along to her loud declarations, while nervously clutching the forensic audit binder to his chest. He looked utterly pathetic, a grown man hiding behind his elderly aunt's theatrical outrage because he completely lacked the intellect and the courage to fight his own battles. The morning rush of executives, international clients, and junior associates had come to a grinding halt. Dozens of people in expensive tailored suits were lingering near the security turnstiles, their briefcases clutched tightly as they watched the unbelievable spectacle unfold. Aunt Yvonne continued to scream, demanding that the chief executive officer come down from the penthouse and fire me on the spot. She yelled that Vanguard Financial was complicit in elder abuse, and that she would absolutely not leave the premises until I was brought down to the lobby in handcuffs. The security guards formed a tight protective semicircle around the reception desk, maintaining their professional distance, but clearly struggling to contain the explosive, volatile situation without escalating it to physical force. While Aunt Yvonne provided the ear-splitting auditory assault, Kendra was busy orchestrating the visual component of their ambush. She was standing slightly off to the side, completely ignoring her husband's ongoing panic attack, entirely focused on the glowing screen of her latest smartphone. She had launched a live video stream directly to her thousands of social media followers, leveraging the massive, intimidating corporate backdrop to legitimize her fabricated victimhood. She held the phone high, catching the perfect angle of the imposing marble columns, the bewildered security guards, and her own perfectly contoured face. Kendra was putting on the performance of a lifetime, tapping into every ounce of her influencer training. She forced large, crocodile tears to well up in her eyes, letting them spill dramatically over her expensive foundation. She stared directly into the camera lens, her voice shaking with manufactured devastation as she addressed her audience. She claimed that she and her husband were currently standing in the lobby of a corrupt Wall Street firm, bravely fighting for their family's survival against an evil sister. She spun a wild, completely fabricated narrative, loudly accusing me of engaging in horrific financial manipulation. She told her viewers that I had secretly infiltrated my dying father's house, pretending to be a loving, devoted caregiver, while actually hacking into his personal accounts and transferring millions of dollars into my own offshore pockets. Kendra wiped her fake tears, ensuring the camera captured her perfectly highlighted distress, and continued to gaslight the entire lobby. She watched the little digital hearts and shocked emojis float up the side of her screen, feeding off the instant validation of her completely deceived audience. She loudly proclaimed that I was a cold, calculating sociopath who had deliberately driven my father into a massive stroke just to seize control of his construction assets. She warned her followers and the gathering crowd of corporate professionals that Vanguard Financial was employing a dangerous predator who preyed on vulnerable minorities and elderly family members. She urged her viewers to share the stream, begging for public support to stop me from throwing her and her innocent husband out onto the cold streets. It was a brilliant, utterly shameless manipulation tactic. Kendra knew that highly elite corporate environments absolutely despised public scandals, especially those involving loud accusations of financial exploitation and racial injustice. She was actively trying to weaponize the court of public opinion, hoping the sheer embarrassment of the viral livestream would force Vanguard's upper management to terminate my employment, simply to make the very loud problem disappear. She panned the camera around the lobby, capturing the faces of my shocked coworkers, demanding that they look at the absolute monster they were working alongside. She shrieked that I had no soul, that I had hated my successful brother since childhood, and that this entire audit was an elaborate, jealous scheme to destroy a prominent black businessman. Trevon finally chimed in for the camera, stepping into the frame to look appropriately somber and defeated. He held up the heavy legal documents, falsely claiming they were fraudulent papers I had forced our incapacitated father to sign while he was heavily medicated. They were throwing every single wild accusation at the wall, hoping the sheer volume of their aggressive lies would overwhelm the truth. They desperately wanted to humiliate me so thoroughly, so completely, that I would break down, cry, and surrender the holding company out of pure public shame. They genuinely believed that if they made enough noise, I would instantly revert to the quiet, submissive sister who always backed down to avoid causing a scene. They were entirely wrong. The executive elevator chimed softly as it reached the ground floor, signaling my arrival. The heavy, brushed steel doors slid open, and I stepped out into the chaotic, echoing lobby. I did not cower. I did not hide my face from Kendra's glowing smartphone lens or attempt to shield myself from the hundreds of judging eyes. I did not look the least bit embarrassed, flustered, or ashamed of the massive spectacle my family was causing. I walked forward with terrifying, absolute composure. My posture was perfectly straight, my tailored suit flawlessly crisp, my expression a mask of pure, unbothered authority. Malik flanked me on my right side, his presence exuding silent, lethal professionalism. Immediately, Marcus and 3 heavily armed building security officers stepped away from the main reception desk, falling perfectly into step behind me, forming an impenetrable, highly intimidating phalanx of corporate protection. The sharp, rhythmic click of my patent leather stilettos cut through the ambient noise of the crowd, drawing every single eye in the massive lobby directly to me. As I approached the center of the pristine marble floor, the murmuring crowd of executives, managing partners, and senior analysts naturally parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me and my security detail. Aunt Yvonne saw me first. Her loud theatrical screaming died instantly in her throat, her mouth snapping shut as she took in the sight of the niece she used to order around like a subservient maid. She had expected to see a panicked, weeping girl begging her to stop making a scene. Instead, she was staring at a senior corporate predator radiating immense, untouchable power. Trevin instinctively took a step backward, his eyes widening in pure terror as he realized his intimidation tactic had completely failed. Kendra kept her phone raised, still broadcasting to her followers, but her fake sobbing hitched as I walked directly into the center of her camera frame, refusing to look away. I stopped exactly 5 feet away from my family, my security team fanning out seamlessly behind me to block any sudden movements. I did not raise my voice to match their chaotic volume. I did not match their hysterical energy. I simply looked at Trayvon, my gaze cold and hollow, and watched the remaining color drain entirely from his face as he realized he had just brought a knife to a nuclear fight and I was holding the launch codes. Trevin could not handle the suffocating silence. The absolute lack of fear in my expression shattered the fragile remains of his ego. He broke the invisible barrier between us, surging forward with a sudden violent burst of energy until the tips of his scuffed leather shoes nearly touched my pristine heels. He thrust a trembling, accusatory finger directly into my face, his breath reeking of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated desperation. He demanded that I march right back up to my office, log into my encrypted terminal, and immediately draft a full legally binding reversal of the debt assumption. He shouted that I was going to sign away my holding company right there in the lobby, or he would personally sue me for everything Vanguard Financial was worth. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let his empty, pathetic threats wash over me like a light drizzle against a titanium wall. His utter lack of leverage was deeply embarrassing to witness. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the frantic darting of his eyes, as he realized his aggressive posturing was completely failing to intimidate me. Seeing that Trayvon's demands were doing absolutely nothing to break my composure, Aunt Yvonne decided to escalate the ambush. She shoved her considerable weight past one of the junior security guards, her face contorted into a mask of pure self-righteous fury. She fed off Trayvon's chaotic energy, screaming that I was a vile, heartless traitor to my own bloodline. She yelled that my father had broken his back to build a historic legacy, and I was casually tearing it down out of pure, bitter jealousy because I was never the favorite child. She weaponized her age and her race, loudly proclaiming to the surrounding crowd of Wall Street executives that I was actively participating in the systemic destruction of successful black men. She shrieked that I was a corporate sellout, eagerly stealing generational black wealth from my own flesh and blood just to earn a bonus from my white superiors. The absolute hypocrisy of her words was staggering, considering Trayvon had single-handedly burned that generational wealth to the ground to buy cryptocurrency and sports cars. Her rage reached a boiling point. She raised her hand, her heavy gold bracelets clanking loudly against each other, and swung her arm in a wide, vicious arc aimed directly at my cheek. She fully intended to physically strike me, hoping to provoke a reaction, or completely humiliate me in front of my elite colleagues. I did not even have to raise a hand to defend myself. Marcus moved with lightning speed, stepping smoothly between us and catching Aunt Yvonne's wrist in a vice-like grip before her hand could even come close to my skin. He held her arm firmly suspended in mid-air, his face a mask of stone-cold professional warning. Aunt Yvonne shrieked, demanding he unhand her, screaming about being assaulted by corporate thugs. Trayvon puffed out his chest, stepping toward Marcus in a feeble, transparent attempt to defend her, but Malik simply shifted his weight. Malik crossed his arms and fixed my brother with a stare so lethally calm and deeply menacing that Trayvon instantly froze in his tracks, his false bravado evaporating entirely. The entire lobby watched in stunned, breathless silence as the tension reached an absolute crescendo. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the massive room. I simply held out my right hand, and Malik immediately placed a sleek black Vanguard financial folder into my palm. I opened the heavy cardstock cover and pulled out a thick stack of printed bank statements, wire transfer logs, and highly classified federal audit receipts. I held the papers up for a brief moment, letting the harsh fluorescent lights of the lobby illuminate the undeniable mathematical proof of Trayvon's complete destruction. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I simply let go. The crisp, white pages fluttered through the air, raining down onto the polished marble floor between us. They scattered like falling leaves, covering the space at Trayvon's feet with the exact, documented history of his massive embezzlement. I watched his eyes track the falling papers, recognizing his own forged signatures and the offshore routing numbers he thought were completely untraceable. With my brother entirely neutralized by the physical manifestation of his own guilt, I turned my sharp, unwavering attention to Kendra. She was still holding her smartphone high, her fake tears drying rapidly on her cheeks as she realized the dynamic of the confrontation had violently shifted. The camera lens was pointed directly at my face, actively broadcasting this entire disastrous encounter to her thousands of eager followers. I stepped smoothly around the scattered bank statements and walked directly into the frame of her live stream. I did not look at Kendra. I looked straight into the tiny camera lens, bypassing her entirely to address her digital audience. My voice was crisp, articulate, and completely devoid of emotion. I stated that she was currently wearing a pristine limited edition Chanel handbag that retailed for exactly $10,000. I kept my eyes locked on the lens as I explained that my forensic audit proved down to the exact second that Trayvon had purchased that specific luxury bag, using funds maliciously siphoned directly from our disabled father's retirement accounts. I took a half step closer to Kendra, forcing her to look at me instead of the glowing screen. I told her that she was not a victim of a corporate conspiracy or elder abuse. I told her that she was actively currently live streaming her own complicity in federal crimes to the entire internet. The effect was absolutely instantaneous. I glanced at the screen of her phone and watched the rolling comments shift violently. The supportive heart emojis and angry messages directed at me vanished, instantly replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated shock. Her followers were reacting in real time to the terrifying revelation that their favorite luxury influencer was unknowingly broadcasting the very evidence federal prosecutors would use to seize her assets. Kendra looked down at her own screen, her eyes widening in pure horror, as the chat filled with accusations, screen recording notifications, and absolute disbelief. She realized with crushing, suffocating clarity that she had just handed the Internal Revenue Service a perfectly packaged high-definition video confession. The absolute terrifying realization of their criminal liability completely froze my family in place. Trayvon was staring blankly at the scattered bank statements, finally comprehending that he could not bully his way out of a mathematical certainty. Aunt Yvonne had gone entirely mute, her arm dropping limply to her side as Marcus released her wrist. Kendra was frantically fumbling with her smartphone, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking uncontrollably as she desperately tried to end the live broadcast before she incriminated herself any further. The blustering arrogance that had fueled their grand lobby ambush was entirely dead, instantly replaced by the suffocating, paralyzing fear of impending federal prosecution. They had absolutely nothing left to say. I turned my back on them, dismissing their very existence with a simple, barely perceptible nod to Marcus. I ordered security to remove them from the premises immediately. Marcus and his highly trained team moved in with absolute unyielding precision. They grabbed Trayvon firmly by the arms, physically marching his limp, defeated body toward the exit without an ounce of gentleness. Two guards flanked Aunt Yvonne forcefully, ushering her away from the reception desk, while she sputtered incoherent, panicked protests, no longer eager to cause a scene. Kendra was practically dragged backward through the heavy, revolving glass doors, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished marble floor. As she was violently pushed out onto the bustling Manhattan sidewalk, she managed to twist around her face, contorted with a final desperate surge of pure venom. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing shrilly through the thick glass panels, threatening to completely expose me at the highly anticipated Black Excellence Gala this coming weekend. She shrieked that I was absolutely dead in this city, promising a social execution that would ruin my career forever. I did not even flinch at the sound of her frantic, pathetic threats. Malik stepped up beside me, silently handing me a perfectly brewed espresso in a crisp, white cup. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the hot coffee, turning my attention back toward the executive elevators, completely untroubled by the hollow screams of a woman who had just live-streamed her own financial funeral. The evening of the Black Excellence Gala arrived with the crisp electric promise of absolute finality. This was the most highly anticipated philanthropic and social event of the Manhattan season, a gathering where fortunes were celebrated, charities were funded, and legacies were permanently cemented. Tonight, I was not merely an attendee. I was being formally honored as one of the top financial minds in the entire city, an accolade that came with a massive crystal trophy and the undivided attention of the most powerful people in the state. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my penthouse suite, observing the final stages of my preparation. The sleek charcoal pinstripes of the corporate battlefield were gone, replaced by a breathtaking custom emerald green evening gown that draped over my frame like liquid glass. The heavy silk caught the ambient light shimmering with every slight movement, while the plunging neckline and daring thigh-high slit projected an aura of untouchable, unapologetic power. My hair was swept up into an immaculate, intricate style that exposed the sharp line of my jaw and the heavy dripping weight of the diamond chandelier earrings brushing my shoulders. My makeup artist applied the final stroke of a deep, fierce crimson lipstick, stepping back to admire her work with a satisfied, silent nod. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like the invisible, neglected daughter who had been pushed into the shadows of a crumbling Brooklyn brownstone to serve men who despised her. I looked like a queen surveying her kingdom right before a highly anticipated execution. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that Trayvon and Kendra were currently scrambling to put together whatever pathetic, rented luxury clothing they could still afford on maxed-out credit lines. Kendra had made her desperate threat loud and clear in the Vanguard financial lobby, and her blinding need for public validation would absolutely not allow her to back down. They were planning to crash the gala. They were planning to march into a room filled with billionaires, politicians, and media moguls to stage a massive weeping intervention. They genuinely believed that if they cornered me in front of the city's elite, I would be so paralyzed by the fear of social embarrassment that I would surrender my wealth to avoid a public scandal. I smiled at my reflection, a cold, predatory curve of the lips. They were completely underestimating the lethal trap I had meticulously laid for them. I strapped a diamond-encrusted watch to my wrist, the heavy platinum band cold against my skin. Every single detail of this evening had been curated for maximum impact. I dismissed my glam team, grabbed my metallic clutch, and stepped out into the waiting town car. The soft, powerful hum of the engine matched the steady, relentless pulse of my ambition. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel hummed with the sophisticated low-frequency vibrations of extreme wealth and influence. I bypassed the flashing cameras at the main entrance, temporarily slipping through a heavily guarded side door that led directly into the restricted backstage staging area. Malik was already waiting for me near the massive audiovisual control booth, looking dangerously sharp in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He did not say a word as I approached. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small encrypted titanium flash drive. The heavy metal felt incredibly significant in my palm. It was the digital guillotine. We stepped into a soundproof alcove, the muffled bass of the gala's live jazz band pulsing through the thick walls. Malik tapped the screen of his tablet, bringing up the final highly classified checklist of our operation. He confirmed that the venue's head of security had been fully briefed on the exact identity of our expected gatecrashers. Trayvon and Kendra were absolutely not going to be stopped at the door. I had specifically instructed the security team to let them bypass the velvet ropes, ignore their lack of invitations, and allow them to enter the main ballroom unhindered. I wanted them fully inside the cage before I permanently dropped the lock. Malik pointed to a schematic of the ballroom's massive projection screens. He explained that the flash drive I held contained the undeniable high-definition culmination of my 2-year forensic audit. It held the offshore routing numbers, the forged signature documents, the undeniable proof of embezzlement, and a perfectly edited montage of Kendra's own disastrous live streams, all completely verified and stamped by federal financial investigators. Malik had personally bribed and integrated the drive with the main control board technicians. I was scheduled to give a 10-minute acceptance speech right before the mayor's keynote address. Malik confirmed that at the exact moment I gave the visual signal, the standard background graphics would drop, and my evidence would be blasted across 4 massive 2-story high screens for every single billionaire investor and media outlet in the room to see. We were not just planning to defend against their inevitable public tantrum. We were going to obliterate them. We were going to completely strip away Trayvon's false reputation and expose him as a desperate thieving fraud in front of the very people he spent his entire life trying to impress. I ran my thumb over the edge of the titanium drive, the cold metal grounding me to the present moment. I thanked Malik for his flawless execution of the logistics. He offered a sharp, wolfish grin, adjusting his bow tie as he replied that he would not miss this particular show for the world. We reviewed the final timing protocols, ensuring that the federal authorities who had been quietly monitoring Trayvon's crumbling accounts were also given a subtle heads-up about the evening's entertainment. The trap was loaded, the stage was perfectly set, and the audience was currently taking their seats. I slipped the drive into the secret pocket of my clutch, taking one last deep breath of the cool backstage air. It was time to step out into the light. I emerged from the backstage corridor and stepped directly onto the plush crimson fabric of the red carpet. The atmosphere hit me like a physical wave. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume-aged bourbon and the intoxicating magnetic pull of elite power. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding staccato rhythm as the paparazzi clamored against the velvet ropes, shouting my name and begging for a look at the woman of the hour. I paused at the center of the step and repeat backdrop, letting the emerald silk of my gown pool perfectly around my feet. I offered the cameras a practiced, serene smile, exuding the absolute untouchable control of a financial titan who had already conquered the world. The reporters shouted questions about my massive success, my unprecedented promotion at Vanguard Financial, and my strategy for navigating the volatile global markets. I answered with sharp, concise sound bites, maintaining intense eye contact with the lenses while projecting an aura of complete, unbothered supremacy. As I moved off the carpet and entered the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of the event became vividly clear. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over dozens of circular tables, each adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and dripping amaranth. The room was packed to the brim with the city's most connected power players. Mayors, hedge fund managers, celebrity philanthropists, and real estate moguls mingled freely, holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. I glided gracefully through the crowd, accepting warm handshakes and respectful congratulations from men and women who controlled global industries. Every step I took reinforced my permanent earned placement in this exclusive world. But even as I smiled and exchanged pleasantries with managing partners and international dignitaries, my peripheral vision remained entirely focused on the grand, gilded doors at the far end of the ballroom. I was a predator silently watching the tree line. I knew the exact suffocating desperation that fueled my brother and his influencer wife. I knew they could not resist the lure of these flashing cameras and the desperate burning need to reclaim their shattered pride in front of the cameras. They would come. They would march through those doors dripping in leased jewelry and rented confidence, ready to launch their pathetic ambush to ruin my greatest night. I took a sip of my champagne, the bubbles crisp and cold against my tongue, feeling my heartbeat slow to a steady rhythmic thud. The jazz band transitioned into a smooth, upbeat tempo, and the event organizers began gently guiding the elite guests toward their assigned tables. I took my seat at the head table, positioned perfectly at the center of the room, with an unobstructed, commanding view of the entrance and the main stage. The ambient chatter of the wealthy washed over me, a soothing soundtrack to the final moments of my waiting game. I casually checked the clasp of my metallic clutch, feeling the solid, heavy shape of the flash drive hidden within. The calm before the execution was always the most exhilarating part. I kept my eyes locked on the gilded doors, my smile never wavering, absolutely ready to welcome my family to their total, inescapable destruction. The soft melodic clinking of heavy silver flatware against fine bone china slowly faded into a respectful, highly anticipatory hush as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the grand acrylic podium. He was a prominent, nationally syndicated financial news anchor, and his deep, resonant voice commanded immediate authority as he tapped the microphone. He began to speak passionately about the vital importance of integrity, relentless ambition, and brilliant financial strategy in today's increasingly volatile global economic landscape. His voice boomed flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing majestically off the gilded walls and vaulted ceilings of the Plaza Hotel ballroom. He spoke eloquently of a woman who had completely shattered corporate glass ceilings, a visionary who had entirely redefined the complex world of forensic accounting and who was actively reshaping the elite future of Vanguard Financial. When he finally announced my name, declaring me the recipient of the Financial Innovator of the Year award, the entire massive room erupted into a thunderous, deafening, and sustained standing ovation. I stood up gracefully from the center table, carefully smoothing the emerald silk of my custom-tailored evening gown. I offered a polite, deeply appreciative nod to the tables of managing directors, tech billionaires, and federal regulators surrounding me. Every single eye in that magnificent, opulent space was fixed firmly and respectfully on me. I made my way through the labyrinth of perfectly decorated tables, the crisp white spotlight tracking my every step toward the main stage. The heavy, flawless diamond chandelier earrings brushed against my collarbone, a physical, sparkling reminder of the absolute power I had meticulously cultivated over the past 2 years. I climbed the short flight of velvet-covered stairs, with total confidence accepting the heavy, dazzling crystal trophy from the presenter with a warm, measured smile. Standing behind that polished podium, looking out over a glittering sea of the most influential, wealthy, and highly connected individuals in the entire state, the feeling of absolute, undeniable supremacy was incredibly intoxicating. I adjusted the slim microphone, fully preparing to deliver the concise, highly polished acceptance speech I had spent weeks rehearsing. The encrypted titanium flash drive felt heavily significant inside my metallic clutch, resting securely on the podium shelf. I took a deep, centering breath, letting the warm glow of the stage lights wash over my face, savoring the absolute pinnacle of my professional existence. Just as I opened my mouth to utter my first word of profound gratitude, the heavy, ornate wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom burst open with a violent, echoing, and terrifying crash. The sudden, jarring explosion of noise instantly killed the celebratory atmosphere, snapping every single head in the massive room abruptly toward the main entrance. Two seasoned event coordinators in black headsets lunged forward to intercept the unexpected disturbance, but they were forcefully, aggressively shoved aside. Trayvon stormed down the center aisle, marching furiously across the plush crimson carpet with the frantic, crazed, and highly volatile energy of a cornered animal. His lace tuxedo was ill-fitting and heavily wrinkled, his bow tie hanging lopsided around his neck, providing a stark, jarring contrast to the immaculate, highly expensive tailoring worn by the rest of the elite room. Kendra was right on his heels, her face already contorted into a deeply disturbing mask of pure theatrical agony. They completely ignored the angry protests of the event staff and the security guards I had specifically secretly ordered to let them pass. Trayvon did not even pause at the edge of the audience. He charged directly up the velvet stairs, his heavy, uncoordinated footsteps thudding loudly and aggressively against the polished stage floor. Before the bewildered master of ceremonies could even reach out to intervene or signal for backup, Trayvon lunged forward and violently snatched the microphone right out of its metal stand. The speakers shrieked instantly with a sharp, piercing burst of audio feedback, causing several prominent guests in the front row to physically wince and cover their ears in pain. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, securely clutching my crystal award, silently watching my brother launch into the most desperate, pathetic, and unhinged performance of his entire miserable life. Trayvon gripped the microphone with both shaking hands, his chest heaving heavily as he stared wildly out at the sea of shocked billionaires and media moguls. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, forcing a massive wet tear to roll down his sweaty cheek. He choked out a loud, highly amplified sob, his voice cracking with manufactured devastation as he begged the wealthy audience to listen to his warning. He pointed a trembling, aggressively accusatory finger directly at my face, loudly declaring to the entire room that the woman they were currently honoring tonight was a cold-blooded, calculating, and ruthless monster. He shouted that my corporate success was built entirely on a dark foundation of pure evil and horrific familial betrayal. He spun a wild, hysterical, and completely fabricated narrative, telling the silent, captivated ballroom that I had completely abandoned my own family during our darkest, most desperate hour. He cried hysterically into the microphone, wildly claiming that I had maliciously manipulated complex legal documents to steal his rightful inheritance and illegally seize control of his lucrative construction business. He yelled at the top of his lungs that I had heartlessly, violently kicked our sick, disabled, and elderly father out onto the cold, unforgiving streets just to line my own offshore bank accounts. He painted a horrifying, vivid, and completely false picture of a ruthless financial predator who preyed specifically on her own vulnerable flesh and blood, happily sacrificing her father's fragile health and her brother's entire livelihood just to climb the corporate ladder at Vanguard Financial. He desperately begged the influential audience not to applaud a woman who lacked a basic human soul, sobbing uncontrollably that his innocent family was currently facing absolute, terrifying ruin while I paraded around in custom emerald silk and expensive diamonds. He was giving it absolutely everything he had, utilizing every single ounce of emotional manipulation he had ever learned, desperately trying to weaponize the sheer shock value of his aggressive public breakdown. The immediate, heavy aftermath of Trayvon's explosive televised accusations was profoundly and undeniably chilling. The grand ballroom, previously buzzing with sophisticated charm, warm congratulations, and polite applause, instantly dissolved into a chaotic sea of shocked, scandalized, and deeply uncomfortable whispers. The air in the room grew incredibly thick, suffocating under the heavy weight of the massive, ugly allegations hanging menacingly over the stage. These were men and women who dealt exclusively in billions individuals whose entire highly lucrative livelihoods depended entirely on pristine public reputations, flawless optics, and absolute corporate trust. A public scandal of this sheer magnitude, a loud, highly broadcast accusation of blatant elder abuse and malicious financial theft, was absolute undeniable poison in their heavily guarded world. I watched the physical shift happen in real time across the room. The elite, powerful investors sitting at the tables closest to the stage people who had just moments ago been eager to shake my hand and discuss highly lucrative future partnerships, visibly recoiled in their plush seats. They actively leaned away, whispering furiously to each other behind raised hands and crystal glasses, their facial expressions rapidly transforming from respectful admiration to pure, unadulterated disgust. The media representatives and financial journalists, scattered throughout the back of the room, immediately raised their heavy cameras and glowing smartphones, capturing every single second of the spectacular, deeply humiliating disaster unfolding before them. Down in the center aisle, Kendra was flawlessly executing the second phase of their coordinated ambush. She had completely collapsed onto her knees on the red carpet, clutching her face as she sobbed loudly enough for the entire back half of the cavernous room to hear. She wailed hysterically about losing her home, crying out that they had absolutely nothing left to their names, playing the role of the innocent, victimized, and entirely broken wife to absolute theatrical perfection. Several prominent wealthy socialites actually rushed to her side, offering her silk tissues and comforting pats on the shoulder, entirely taken in by her brilliant, deeply manipulative performance. The entire room was turning against me with terrifying, undeniable, and sweeping speed. The master of ceremonies looked completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the stage, unsure whether to urgently call for security or let the deeply uncomfortable, highly damaging drama play out. The Vanguard financial executives sitting at the designated corporate sponsor tables looked absolutely horrified, their faces turning completely pale as they realized their newly crowned, highly celebrated star was currently the center of a massive, incredibly toxic public scandal. Trevin stood triumphantly on the stage, his chest puffing out slightly as he registered the shifting, chaotic dynamic of the massive room. He shot me a fleeting, incredibly venomous look of pure, unadulterated triumph, completely convinced that he had just delivered the ultimate fatal blow. He genuinely believed that the sheer, overwhelming embarrassment of this public character assassination would force me to instantly resign, hand over his frozen assets, and disappear permanently into absolute obscurity. The entire ballroom was staring directly at me, waiting breathlessly for my reaction, fully expecting me to break down in humiliated tears or run off the stage in absolute undeniable disgrace. The trap they had meticulously built had seemingly snapped completely shut around me, locking me tightly in a cage of inescapable public ruin. I did not flinch. I did not step forward to wrestle the microphone from his sweating, trembling hands. I did not raise my voice in a desperate, frantic attempt to defend my character against his vicious, fabricated slander. To react with anger or panic would only validate his performance, feeding into the exact narrative he was desperately trying to sell to the horrified audience. I knew that the absolute most terrifying weapon I could wield in this exact moment was complete, unyielding silence. I simply stood my ground at the center of the stage, a statue carved from emerald silk and ice, holding my heavy crystal award with relaxed, steady hands. The sheer, overwhelming emptiness of my physical reaction created a jarring, uncomfortable contrast to his manic, sobbing hysteria. Traven was practically vibrating with adrenaline, his chest heaving heavily, as he waited for me to crack, waiting for the defensive shouting match that would ultimately seal my social execution. He pushed the dead microphone toward my face, a taunting, aggressive gesture, daring me to speak and incriminate myself. I simply offered him a slow, chillingly vacant smile that made the color drain completely from his face. I turned my head away from my brother, entirely dismissing his existence, and looked up through the harsh glare of the stage lights toward the elevated audiovisual booth at the back of the massive ballroom. Malik was standing perfectly still behind the tinted glass, his hands hovering over the master control console, our eyes locked across the sea of elite billionaires and horrified socialites. I did not need to issue a verbal command, I did not need to scream, I simply gave a single, barely perceptible nod. The response was instantaneous and absolutely earth-shattering. The smooth, ambient jazz music that had been softly playing beneath Trevon's manufactured sobbing abruptly cut out, replaced by a sharp electronic hum that vibrated heavily through the floorboards of the stage. The massive two-story high 4K projection screens, flanked on either side of the grand stage, violently flickered to life. The glowing, elegant Vanguard Financial corporate logos completely vanished. They were replaced by the stark, grainy, and undeniably authentic interface of a high-definition hidden security camera. The timestamp glowing brightly in the top right corner of the massive screens read precisely 10 minutes after I had originally walked out of the Brooklyn brownstone on the day of the will reading. The sudden shift in the audiovisual presentation caused a ripple of confusion throughout the elite crowd. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in haute couture murmured to one another, their champagne flutes suspended in midair as they tried to comprehend the jarring interruption. Malik had executed the technical hijack flawlessly, ensuring that every single monitor display and projection unit in the grand ballroom was entirely synchronized to my encrypted flash drive. The sheer scale of the projection made it impossible for anyone to look away. Trevin instantly froze, his arm dropping limply to his side as the deafening feedback of the microphone echoed through the silent ballroom. He turned his head slowly, his eyes tracking the glowing blue light emanating from the screens behind us. The crystal-clear amplified audio from the hidden nanny cam suddenly blasted through the Plaza Hotel's state-of-the-art sound system, completely overriding Trayvon's dead microphone. It was not a polished corporate biography or a philanthropic highlight reel. It was the raw, unfiltered, and deeply horrifying reality of my family's absolute depravity broadcast in massive cinematic detail for the entire financial world to witness. The camera angle provided a wide, unobstructed view of my father's cluttered, dimly lit living room. My father, Desmond, was sitting quietly in his worn medical recliner, his frail, disabled body looking impossibly small, wrapped in a faded, knitted blanket. The ballroom audience, filled with men and women who had just been ready to socially crucify me collectively, gasped as they recognized the sick elderly man Trayvon had just finished tearfully defending. On the massive screens, the living room door forcefully swung open and the recorded version of Trayvon stormed into the frame. He was not weeping. He was not the broken, desperate victim he was currently pretending to be on the stage. He was completely enraged, his face contorted into an ugly, violent sneer of pure, unadulterated greed. The audio captured his voice with terrifying clarity, completely devoid of the pathetic, trembling sorrow he had just utilized to manipulate the gala attendees. His recorded voice barked out harsh, cruel demands, echoing loudly across the silent, captivated ballroom. He began pacing aggressively back and forth in front of my father's chair, waving a sheaf of legal documents in the air. The elite crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the true nature of my brother was laid completely bare. Trayvon was not protecting my father, he was actively terrorizing him. The recorded footage showed Trevin looming over the frail old man, jabbing his finger aggressively into my father's personal space, demanding that he immediately sign over the remaining equity of the brownstone. The sheer, terrifying contrast between the sobbing, victimized man standing on the stage and the aggressive, abusive predator projected on the screens behind him was absolute and staggering. The trap I had laid was not just closing, it was crushing them completely. The entire gala watched in dead, suffocating silence as the digital recording escalated into physical violence. On the massive screens, my father weakly shook his head, his frail hands trembling as he refused to sign away his home. The recorded? Trevon lost his temper completely. He lunged forward and violently shoved his own disabled father back into the recliner, the physical impact causing the elderly man to gasp in sudden sharp pain. Trevon then pulled a glossy, highly expensive nursing home brochure from his jacket pocket and viciously threw it directly into my father's face. The heavy paper smacked loudly against the old man's cheek, fluttering to the floor as Trevon screamed that they were selling the house and dumping him in a state-run facility whether he liked it or not. A collective horrified shudder rippled through the elite audience. The gasps were audible, raw, and completely unfiltered. Investors and politicians who had stepped away from me moments ago now stared at the screens with absolute, unadulterated revulsion. The video feed seamlessly hard-cut to a second timestamp advancing exactly 3 hours later. The lighting in the living room had dimmed, signaling the arrival of evening. My father was fast asleep in his recliner, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. The ballroom audience watched as Kendra slinked into the frame, moving with calculated predatory silence. She crept up beside the sleeping old man, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway to ensure she was completely alone. The high-definition camera captured every single damning detail as she carefully reached down, unclasped the heavy vintage gold Rolex from my disabled father's fragile wrist, and slipped the priceless heirloom directly into her designer handbag. She then smoothed his blanket with a sickeningly fake smile and tiptoed right back out of the room like a common thief in the night. The undeniable, brutal truth was laid bare for the entire elite society to see broadcast in inescapable high definition. The silence in the ballroom was absolute heavy, with the devastating permanent ruin of my abusers. Trevin dropped the microphone. It hit the stage floor with a loud, hollow thud, rolling away from his feet as he stared at his own monstrous actions projected above him, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Kendra was still kneeling in the center aisle, her fake sobs instantly dying in her throat as she watched herself commit a felony on a 40-foot screen. The wealthy socialites who had been comforting her rapidly pulled their hands away, taking several disgusted steps back, as if she were suddenly infected with a highly contagious disease. The influential power brokers who had just been whispering about my corporate downfall were now staring at my family with pure lethal contempt. The social execution they had planned for me had completely backfired, entirely incinerating their own lives instead. They were entirely, utterly destroyed. The suffocating silence that descended upon the Plaza Hotel ballroom was absolute and deeply terrifying. It was a heavy physical weight that pressed down on every single person in the room. The microphone Trevon had dropped continued to emit a low rhythmic hum as it rolled across the polished mahogany stage, coming to a dead stop right at the tip of my stilettos. Trevon stood frozen, his eyes wide and completely vacant, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of his own spectacular demise. He looked out at the sea of Manhattan elite, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face among the crowd of billionaires, politicians, and media moguls. He found absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated revulsion. The powerful investors who had previously been willing to listen to his fabricated sob story now glared at him with lethal disgust. Men who controlled global hedge funds turned their backs on him entirely, murmuring to their security details to ensure they were never photographed near him. It was a social and professional obliteration, as precise and mathematically unforgiving as the classified audit reports contained within a file. You can reference named Duyen1_23.docx. Trevin raised his shaking hands, opening his mouth to formulate an excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The damning reality of his violence against our disabled father played on an endless high-definition loop behind him, ensuring no lie could ever save him. Down in the center aisle, the reality of the situation crashed over Kendra with brutal, suffocating force. The elite socialites who had rushed to comfort her just moments ago now treated her like an active biohazard. A prominent philanthropist actively pulled her silk gown away to avoid brushing against Kendra's knees. The terrifying realization that her entire carefully curated influencer lifestyle was permanently dead finally pierced her thick skull. She realized that the evidence broadcasting her theft was just as undeniable as the financial ledgers meticulously detailed in a file you can reference named Duyen 2_23.docs. Panic seized her entirely. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble violently, losing all their strength. The pristine limited edition Chanel handbag she had maliciously purchased with my father's stolen retirement funds slipped from her grasp. It hit the marble floor with a heavy, hollow thud, the gold chain spilling out like a discarded shackle. She stared down at the bag, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths, fully understanding that she was no longer a victim to be pitied. She was a documented criminal, exposed before the most powerful people in the state. The blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras, which she had so eagerly courted upon entering the ballroom, now assaulted her from every angle. The journalists were not capturing her tragic victimization. They were actively documenting the exact, humiliating moment her fraudulent existence burned to ash. The trap I had set was flawless, leaving them absolutely nowhere to run. The heavy gilded oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly swung open with a resounding crash that echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. The ambient lighting of the corridor behind the doors was abruptly pierced by the harsh, sweeping red and blue flashes of emergency vehicles parked directly outside the Plaza Hotel. I had not waited for their public ambush to execute the final stage of my plan. I had formally submitted the entire unedited surveillance footage, the banking records, and a file you can reference named Duyen 3_23.docs directly to the district attorney's office hours before the gala even began. A team of stern, unsmiling detectives in sharp suits marched shoulder to shoulder down the center aisle, their heavy footsteps cutting through the murmurs of the elite crowd. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, flanking the red carpet and entirely ignoring the glittering wealth surrounding them. The lead detective, a tall man with a hardened expression, bypassed Kendra initially and marched straight up the velvet steps of the main stage. Trevon scrambled backward, his hands raised in a pathetic, frantic gesture of surrender, his false bravado entirely replaced by the primal fear of a trapped predator. He babbled incoherently, begging the detective to listen, swearing that the video was manipulated, that it was a corporate setup designed to steal his company. The detective did not even blink. He grabbed Trayvon by the shoulder forcefully, spinning him around, and slammed his wrists together behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. The detective loudly and clearly recited the Miranda rights, declaring the formal charges of elder financial abuse, aggravated embezzlement, and grand larceny directly into the microphone resting on the floor. Trayvon's knees buckled. He let out a gut-wrenching, humiliating shriek of pure terror, sobbing uncontrollably as two uniformed officers hauled his dead weight off the stage. At the exact same moment, two female detectives surrounded Kendra in the center aisle. She frantically tried to scramble away, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished marble floor. She shrieked, pointing wildly at me on the stage, screaming that I was the real criminal, that I had set them up, that the watch was a gift. The detectives were entirely unmoved by her hysterical performance. They gripped her arms firmly, pulling her wrists behind her back and securing the handcuffs with brutal efficiency. The paparazzi went absolutely wild, their camera flashes creating a blinding staccato storm of white light as they captured every single agonizing second of Kendra's arrest. She sobbed violently, her meticulously applied makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as they marched her roughly toward the exit. The entire ballroom watched the spectacle with breathless, horrified fascination. The criminal liability they had tried to pin on me was now wrapped tightly around their own wrists. Every detail of their theft matching the exact financial discrepancies outlined in a file you can reference named Duyen4_23.docs had been validated by the authorities in front of the entire world. They were forcefully dragged through the heavy wooden doors, their frantic, pathetic screams echoing down the marble corridors, until they were completely swallowed by the wail of police sirens outside. The heavy gilded doors slammed shut instantly, severing the chaotic noise of my family's humiliating departure from the refined elegance of the gala. The massive ballroom remained entirely silent, filled with the stunned, electrified tension of hundreds of powerful people attempting to process the unprecedented spectacle they had just witnessed. I stood completely unbothered at the center of the stage. My pulse was steady, my breathing perfectly even. I smoothly bent down, retrieved the microphone from the polished wooden floor, and placed it securely back into its metal stand. I smoothed the emerald silk of my custom gown, ensuring every fold fell perfectly back into place. I adjusted the microphone slightly, letting the harsh, bright spotlight reflect brilliantly off my diamond chandelier earrings. I looked out over the sea of silent, awestruck faces, locking eyes with the very same billionaires and investors who had almost believed Trayvon's fabricated lies minutes earlier. I offered them a warm, flawless, and deeply professional smile entirely devoid of malice or fear. My voice echoed clearly and beautifully through the massive speakers, carrying the unwavering tone of a woman completely in control of her destiny. I stated clearly that while the path to genuine corporate innovation was frequently obstructed by those who lacked vision and integrity, the undeniable truth always prevailed. I transitioned seamlessly back into my prepared acceptance speech, thanking the Vanguard Financial Executive Board for their unwavering trust and expressing my deep, profound gratitude to the philanthropic organizations that tirelessly protected the city's most vulnerable citizens. I spoke passionately about the future of forensic accounting, the absolute necessity of relentless accountability, and the power of uncompromising ambition. I did not mention my brother. I did not mention his wife. I dismissed their existence from the narrative entirely, treating their dramatic arrest as nothing more than a minor, insignificant logistical delay. I concluded my speech by raising my heavy crystal trophy into the air, thanking the crowd for their exceptional time and their continued dedication to corporate excellence. For a fraction of a second, the room remained entirely still. Then, Malik began a slow, deliberate clap from the audio-visual booth. The mayor followed, standing up at the front table. Within seconds, the entire grand ballroom erupted. The applause started as a low rumble and violently swelled into a deafening, thunderous roar. Every single billionaire, politician, and media mogul rose to their feet, delivering a massive, passionate standing ovation that shook the very foundations of the Plaza Hotel. I stood beneath the blinding stage lights, holding my award high, basking in the absolute, unquestionable victory of a queen who had flawlessly defended her throne. The sharp ring of my private cell phone cut through the quiet hum of my corner office. Exactly 1 month had passed since the gala, and the Vanguard Financial Executive Suite was now entirely my domain. I glanced at the glowing screen, my eyes narrowing slightly at the unfamiliar generic caller ID. It traced back to a state-run assisted living facility in upstate New York. I answered the call, my voice crisp and professional. The heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line was instantly recognizable. It was Desmond. His voice was no longer the booming, authoritative bark that had dictated my entire childhood, demanding absolute obedience and silent subservience. It was a weak, pathetic wheeze, trembling with manufactured sorrow and undeniable desperation. He began to weep the very moment I acknowledged his presence, the wet, choked sounds echoing through the high-fidelity receiver. He rambled frantically about the absolute nightmare his life had become over the past 4 weeks. He told me that Trayvon had been completely denied bail, and was currently rotting in a federal holding cell facing years in prison for elder financial abuse, embezzlement, and grand larceny. He sobbed as he described how Kendra had immediately filed for divorce the morning after the gala, utterly abandoning Trayvon the second the stolen money dried up and the reality of a criminal trial set in. The IRS had descended like a flock of starving vultures, aggressively seizing Trayvon's frozen bank accounts, his leased luxury cars, and every single asset tied to his fraudulent construction business to pay back the massive debts he owed. Desmond was completely alone, dumped unceremoniously into the exact same cold, unforgiving state-run facility his golden child had viciously threatened him with on camera. He cried hysterically into the phone, begging me to rescue him from the sterile walls, the terrible food, and the sheer isolation of his new reality. He pleaded for my forgiveness, his voice cracking as he promised that things would be completely different if I just let him come live with me in my luxury penthouse. He shamelessly attempted to rewrite our entire history in a desperate, calculating bid for salvation. He called me his brilliant girl, his saving grace, and the true heir to the family legacy. He threw every ounce of emotional manipulation he had left at the wall, desperately hoping that the obedient, yearning daughter he had so easily discarded would magically reappear to save him from the absolute ruin he had engineered. I sat perfectly still behind my polished marble desk, listening to his frantic, weeping pleas echo through the quiet, sunlit office. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect the frail old man crying on the other end of the line. I did not even feel the burning, toxic rage that had fueled my relentless ascent to the top of the financial world over the past 2 years. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord that had tethered me to this man, the desperate, lifelong craving for a father's validation and love, had been permanently severed the day he willfully signed away his home to the son who openly despised him. I let him ramble until he finally ran out of breath, his pathetic sobs dissolving into a heavy, expectant silence. He was waiting for my grace, waiting for the familiar rescue he felt entitled to. When I finally spoke, my voice was a flat, chillingly calm weapon, completely devoid of any human emotion. I did not yell. I did not raise my pitch. I delivered the final, lethal truth with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon extracting a tumor. Your love was always conditional on my submission. I stated the words, slicing through the receiver like ice. I paid my debt to you with 2 years of my youth and by clearing the house of bankruptcy. But the moment you looked me in the eye and chose Trayvon, I stopped being your daughter. I let the absolute finality of my statement hang in the air, ensuring he felt the crushing weight of his own disastrous choices pressing down on his chest. I leaned slightly into the phone, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that offered absolutely zero room for negotiation or debate. You made your bed, Dad. Now lie in it. I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear another fabricated apology, another desperate excuse, or another plea for unearned salvation. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the screen, instantly cutting off the last connection to a family that had only ever viewed me as collateral damage. I permanently blocked the facility's number, setting the device face down on the cool marble. The iron boundary was set and I was finally free. The afternoon sun streamed beautifully through the massive arched windows of the newly renovated Brooklyn brownstone. The heavy, suffocating darkness that had once plagued the old house was entirely gone, replaced by bright, open-concept spaces, gleaming hardwood floors, and vibrant modern art. It was no longer a decaying monument to toxic patriarchal control. It was a thriving, brilliant sanctuary of empowerment. I stood gracefully in the grand entryway, admiring the sleek, polished brass plaque securely mounted to the pristine, exposed brick wall. The deeply engraved letters read, "The Aaliyah Foundation for Black Female Entrepreneurs." I had taken the very sight of my deepest humiliation and completely transformed it into the absolute crown jewel of my philanthropic empire. I had funneled my immense corporate resources into ensuring that no other brilliant, driven woman would ever be financially suffocated or undervalued the way I had been. I walked slowly toward the front window, the emerald silk of my blouse catching the warm light. I looked out over the bustling city streets below, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of peace. I had turned my trauma into a formidable empire. I stood victorious, unapologetically unbothered, and completely free.